महकती खुशबू ने एक एहसास जगाया किसान ने पकाया प्यार से खिलाया रंग मेरी लगन का उन्हें खींच लाया किसान ने पकाया किसान ने पकाया प्यार से खिलाया
किसान ने पकाया प्यार से खिलाया
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I begin as always in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. I want to thank Professor Berger for negotiating this possibility with me. I was actually here for another forum in Rotterdam, and we were able to with the hospitality of my brother Arnold Moore, allow me to stay a bit longer so I could speak with you. And hopefully we will have some interesting conversations afterwards. I'm actually going from a scripted paper, which I have reduced to try to keep within the time. That means that there may be some spaces that are a bit rough because I, literally just reduced it. But I'm going to do that as a way to be able to stay focused because there's a lot that I want to cover. And the purpose of it really is to get to the place of a little bit of conversation about Islamic feminism, which I'm considering a methodology for the production and construction of new knowledge in living Islam. You will see that it will include critical reading of the classical intellectual canon of Islam, but with a lens that incorporates gender as a category of thought. Against the backdrop of the Arab Spring and the radical changes that are going on in the Middle East, this lecture focuses on Islam as a global phenomenon. In fact, there are more progressive gender debates in Indonesia than in all of the Arabic, Farsi, and Turkish-speaking countries combined. This globalization lens has special benefit when looking at the development of the Muslim women's movement. It also helps to locate my work within that movement and grants it legitimacy. I have worked on gender issues in a way that would lead to Islamic feminism before it had a name and before I could own the word feminism as appropriate for my work and perspective. I do not now, nor have I ever, lost sight of my aim: to make certain articulations towards gender equality within the faith or from a faith perspective. I was born in the West to Christian parents. My sojourn in Islam had nothing to do with Western feminist movements because they tended to marginalize women of color, poor women, and non-heterosexual women. My principal motivation in the gender debates is linked to my spiritual yearnings. For God is bigger than any discourse, acts in ways not fathomable to human beings at all, and yet is intimately connected to each human being, even if they choose not to respond to that living presence or reality. So this benevolence is not intended to offend or to be imposed on people who do not believe in God. I say this instead because it is important to my location and to focus on theological elements in the debates over women's empowerment in the context of Islam. We cannot say anything about Islam and Muslims until we're clear what we mean by Islam. Every discussion about Islam and women must begin with the meaning of the word Islam. People involved with the struggle for or against Islamic reform often operate on a presumption that there is a uniform agreement on the meaning of the word. When people say, for example, Islam is a violent religion, or Islam means peace, or Islam prohibits homosexuality, or in Islam you must wear hijab, the source of such abstractions is frequently not provided. One important development that the women's movement helped to forge in international discourse at the end of the 20th century was the distinction between Muslim cultures and Islamic primary sources, that is, the Quran, the established Sunnah, authentic Hadith, and sometimes Islamic law or fiqh. And it's funny because in trying to get people to move away from certain static notions of Islam, even people who are working in progressive Islamic circles tend to defer back to these kind of conservative definitions when they're talking about Islam. So they make themselves as a response to or reaction or an alternative of. And part of what I'm trying to do is to get Islam to be, once again, more dynamic. In the Quran, the word Islam and Muslim are both used with reference to an historical community and to the state or posture, and to a state or posture vis-a-vis all of creation, the posture of conscientious surrender to the harmony of the universe. Indeed, the Quran says all of nature is Muslim. All of creation is harmonious, following a certain order with balance between its constituent parts. In all of my discussions about Islam and about Muslim women, I build upon a definition of Islam encapsulated by its most basic and fundamental principle, Tawheed. There is no Islam without Tawheed. At its most fundamental level, it refers to God as one. For matters of social justice, it refers to the more intensified form of its syntactical origin, the making of one from fragments, that is diversity or plurality. It could be then defined as unity. The social principle of Tawheed mandates a relationship between human beings of equality and reciprocity. The other question we have to figure out when we discuss Islam and women is, what is the role of women in Islam? I work only on the basis of an understanding that the role of a woman is to be a Khalifa on the earth, a moral agent of Allah within the sacred order of balance and harmony in the universe. This teleology is confirmed by the Quranic passage, Inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa, indeed I will create an agent on the earth. Woman was not created as a byproduct of, helpmate for, or second-class citizen to man. Furthermore, her agency is in a direct relationship to God, unmitigated by men, men's agency, or by family. This agency is to be manifest by actions fil ard, in the creation, or literally on the earth, standing up for justice and gender equality, working to reform asymmetrical gender policies, and toppling tyrannical practices and epistemologies are thus essential to an agent as part of the human-divine relationship. These aspects of justice work are all mandated by Allah and established by the prophetic Sunnah. Coincidentally, this is the same as the role of men in Islam. Women are human. They do not depend upon men for their humanity. It is given to them by Allah. While women have always been a part of the community, expected to conform to the development of Islam within that community, in the early development of the foundational paradigms of Islamic thought and practice, they did not enjoy equal participation in establishing the fundamental understanding of what is Islam. In fact, as the Muslim empire spread geographically and politically, especially after the Abbasid period, women's contributions to the fundamental canon of Islam would be further marginalized and ultimately silenced. This had a profound effect on the future of Islamic thought and in the establishment of both legitimacy and authority. If we look back over Islamic history from our vantage point, we see a very minor role that women played in establishing the basic epistemology that would come to stand as authority or legitimacy. For example, in the 12th century, prolific scholar Ahmed al-Ghazali symbolized the agent, that is the Khalifa, the agent in Islamic philosophical terms, by comparison with the lute instrument, you know, the little blowing instrument. He even compared the number of orifices in the body with the number of holes in the lute, totally disregarding the distinctive number of orifices in the female body from the male body. Today, women are present and accounted for at every level of the community, including the scholarly and ritual community. Women participate fully in establishing new canon, constructing new traditions, forming new policies, living in the present, with a loving yet critical eye on the past and a conscious trajectory towards the future. This is proving to be a bit of a corrective for the asymmetry between women and men and Muslim communities. However, we do not go about this without some contention between our voices, perspectives, methods, and objectives. This is natural, inevitable, and for the most part useful. What I will describe here is the historical evolution of three major perspectives regarding Islam and gender reform. The names I have given to each are also not necessarily confirmed by consensus either, but I hope the way that I use these classifications will be self-explanatory and will facilitate discussion afterwards. Of course, in our history, there have always been some for gender justice. We go back maybe to the Prophet's time. People like to mention one of the Prophet's wives, Salama, and after her interrogation of the Prophet about the nature of Quranic revelation and to whom that revelation was addressed, there was a verse revealed that was very explicitly inclusive, indeed, for all men and women who have rendered themselves unto Allah, for all truly devout men and all truly devout women, all women and men who are true to their word, all men and women who are patient in adversity, etc., etc. So there is already a sense in which there is a dynamic, but the voices were still very limited in number. So the point here is as if the Quran says that the Quran is addressed to both women and men. And it is, especially in terms of its ultimate objective, which is human guidance. And while the text is clear about this ultimate objective, there are still many passages in the Quran that address those who held greater privilege in that community. There are passages addressed exclusively to men as male persons. Throughout the text, there is an intricate balance between the speaker, Allah, the performance voice, the Prophet, the voice of those whose stories are told therein, and those to whom the text speaks, which is both the specific community living with the Prophet and all of humankind. Despite evidence of certain exceptional historical voices against gender inequality, today what we are experiencing is a mass movement of women and men against gender asymmetry as injustice. It matters very little if this injustice was established by intent or by accident of discrimination. The Muslim women's movements are also connected to certain global developments. Chief among these developments was the rise and fall of colonialism, and thus the rise of the nation state as a consequence of, for one thing, certain nationalist movements. Unfortunately, women were often not equal beneficiaries of the spoils of these new nationalist regiments. This is the place where the modern Muslim women's movement began in earnest. Like with the current Arab Spring, Muslim women stood side by side with their men or with Muslim men to throw off the shackles of colonialism and build nationalist movements. At that time, most women's organizations were branches of larger nationalist organizations. Once the victory of independence was won, it was not uncommon for women to be asked to return to the home and give up the ideas and the ideals of equal citizenship. And something similar is starting to happen in terms of the aftermath of the Arab Spring. This would herald in a new phase in women's activism that would be independent from the larger men or nationalist organizations for political, social, economic, and legal rights. As Margot Badran wrote, women had a rude awakening when it became clear that liberal men were not prepared to implement their promise to integrate women into public life after nominal political independence. The Muslim women's movement then dates back to this rupture between the development of the notion of free and equal citizens and the prohibition against women's full participation. The development of the nation state and the end of colonialism was also the beginning of a new global awareness. This awareness consists of recognizing local, regional, or national realities against and within the context of realities in a world unlike one's own. Such global awareness is the root of pluralism. Our humanity today is clearly possible only with this sense of pluralism. Pluralism includes the capacity to accept in equal terms that there are those who are different from us. This acceptance reflects our own local realities without projecting these as the ultimate human concern for everyone. The ultimate human concern is beyond narrow, local imagination and praxis, even as it must be seen as a reflection of the ultimate. Thus, our present time is not the only time. Our current place is not the only place. Our existing customs are not the only customs, our worldview not the only worldview. These basic elements of pluralism become essential for the global women's movement. The first wave Muslim women's movement consisted of a kind of methodological overlap and also some repetitions, all aligned with how the nation state would operate, including personal status law or family law, which would only be canonized after the colonial period. The first collective voices of gender reform were from well-to-do, well-educated, and often well-traveled women who had seen firsthand that the world is not uniform. They stood up as Muslim women and as citizens of these new nation states. After this first wave Muslim women's movement, the secular feminist and Islamist articulations of Muslim women's liberation would develop into opposing camps. So at first there was a little bit more integration, and then there's this development of an opposition, which is important to think about. The secular Muslim feminist movement is premised upon the idea that religions are the cause of women's oppression and that they are too patriarchal for redemption. Whether religion is relegated to a personal response or altogether irrelevant depends upon the religiosity of the individual. Deference is given unequivocally to the international instruments as developed by the United Nations and ascribed as universal. Quote, although universalism as it exists today is generally criticized for its implicit ethnocentrism and leaning towards so-called Western values, most women nevertheless recognize the need for, support the principle of, and work towards a new definition of universality in human rights. This discourse participates in the inherent conflict between women's rights and cultures. And according to Madhavi Sunder, but religion qua religion is less the problem than our traditional legal constructions of this category. Premised on centuries-old Enlightenment compromise, that justified reason in the public sphere by allowing deference to religious despotism in the private, human rights law continues to define religion in the 21st century as a sovereign, extra-legal jurisdiction in which inequality is not only accepted but expected. Law views religion as natural, irrational, incontestable, and imposed, in contrast to the public sphere, the only viable space for freedom and reason. Simply put, religion is the other of international law, end quote. At the time of the establishment of the nation-state, the crucial question of the role of religion in the political process led to two opposing sides. One advocating a separation of the state from religion, who would begin to self-identify as secular and sometimes Western, and the other constructing an unquestionable version of Islam as state and religion, or state and faith. The term secular would morph from the simple separation into its more aggressive form. The secularist outlook, quote, is basically one that starts by marginalizing God, or sometimes even announcing his death, placing the human at the center of the universe as its logo. This articulation of secularism would become even more coherent with the rise of the other outspoken public voice in favor of Islam, which would grow into political Islam, that is, the Islamist movement. Throwing off the shackles of colonialism meant challenging the very aspects of the colonialist worldview. The most uniform response to the problems related to the post-colonial Muslim context was a cry to return to the glorious past of the Islamic Empire. With Islam as a solution, a new development emerged in the women's movement as well. Islam as a global phenomenon with a substantial history is, in fact, an important aspect of the debates. But the question is, can we or should we go back to it? The merit of the call to return to Islam was that it is both authentic and authoritative. However, as it continued, it moved to reject all other worldviews as un-Islamic. The Islamist agenda then mandates a return to a perfect Islam of the medieval period or of the time of the Prophet. The intent is to take the spirit of Islam and the soul of Muslim identity to organize the politics of a new world order. Quote, the idea for Muslim modernists was that the remedy for Islam consisted of a textual return away from the blemishes of the later phases back to the yearning for truth of the founders of Islam. In this, they found themselves oddly in full agreement with the Orientalists. They came to be suspicious of many traditions of Islamic thought and practice that developed through time, according to Omid Safi. The Islamist agenda is encapsulated within a cry for the return to Sharia. Quote, although the Islamist thesis that Islam is religion and state and consequently and necessarily requires the application of Sharia, it does not reflect the historical reality. It was and is hugely effective antithesis to secular ideas and authoritarian regimes. At the level of the general public, the cry for a return to Sharia is generally reductionist, collapsing the universal principles of Sharia with the juridical methods and mechanisms of implementation known as fiqh, or the codes that have been produced by this fiqh. The root definition of the word Sharia is the path that leads to water, that is the source of all life. Thus, it is universal, divine, sublime, and an ideal. The goal of this ideal society, or the maqasid, is justice. The more coherent definition of Islamic law that the Islamists are hoping to achieve is fiqh, which is the efforts across Muslim history for understanding that universal, or simply jurisprudence. To distinguish between these two is crucial for debunking the claim that somehow, if Muslim nation states were to establish Islamic law, then all problems would be solved. by toggling between the universal intent of Sharia, which is justice, and the human, necessarily fallible, thus subject to change, mechanisms for its implementation, or fiqh, the Islamists furthermore take license in condemning any who criticize their programs as if they are against Islam. Anyone who resists the establishment of their specific goals is deemed resistant to the implementation of the immutable divine order and even an unbeliever. However, Sharia cannot be implemented except through human procedural means, and that is fiqh, which has always been subject to debate, has always been diverse, has always been flexible. Thus, this lack of uniformity, which we can confirm even by today's modern existence of 4 major Sunni schools and at least 1 major Shia school, means there is no such thing as pure and simple Islamic law. We are up against different realities by the creation of the nation state as well, and by the pluralism of the continual relationship at an international level. There has yet to be a single system constructed by the Islamists that satisfies all the claims of Islamic authenticity and that fulfills all of their objectives. In the nation state, all policies are subject to public debate, including from non-Muslims. Implementation can only occur by the will of the people. People are open to disagree. However, it is clear that whoever has the power to enforce their understanding of Sharia can and will coerce that understanding over all others, even for matters of faith and individual consciousness. As Abdullah Naim says, Sharia principles cannot be enacted and enforced by the state as public law and public policy solely on the grounds that they are believed to be part of Sharia. If such enactment and enforcement is attempted, the outcome will necessarily be the political will of the state and not the Islamic law of Islam. The fact that ruling elites sometimes make claims to legitimize their control of the state in the name of Islam does not mean that such claims are true. The Islamist debates are critical for the women's movement because it usually comes down to the establishment of archaic, pre-modern Muslim personal status law or family laws. In the time of the formulation of Muslim personal status law, Muslim families were unconditionally patriarchal. Women who followed the Islamist agenda promote the significance of the sanctity of family without offering any analysis of what constitutes family and whether existing families are fulfilling the ideals deemed essential to that constitution. Any real crisis experienced in the family is instead simply charged as negligence of Islam. As such, these discussions become cyclical. The solution to family is Islam, and failed families are un-Islamic. Although an important public role for women has also resulted within the Islamist agenda, women's unquestionable obedience to family in its primitive patriarchal form is still unquestioned. Consequently, a bifurcation often occurs between women's public empowerment and their disempowerment in the context of patriarchal families. A pivotal moment in considering whose voices was most beneficial to the cause of Muslim women's well-being, liberation, autonomy, and citizenship came in 1995 with the Beijing International Conference for Women. The Islamists who were present applauded the wisdom behind Islam's position on women. The more aggressive, outspoken, and certainly more aligned with the UN agenda, secular Muslim feminists were also present and refused to yield ground to those they considered backward thinking. Nevertheless, in an attempt to coordinate our efforts, nightly meetings were called for, and these just turned into chaos. It was impossible to find any common ground, and for some reason, each side also felt that More was at stake to preserve their individual perspectives than to find some united agenda for all Muslim women present and for those women whom they claim to represent. Let's look at the larger context of the Beijing meetings. The purpose was to discuss the UN Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW. CEDAW is a UN human rights document with the intent of gathering global signatories from all nation states, and a larger goal to address gross inequalities between female and male citizens of the world. Muslim feminists are closely aligned to the secular trajectory of these international instruments. They are considered universal and not subject to individual states. If there's any conflict, as has been shown to be inevitable, then Muslim women who hope to change gross social and cultural injustices in the context of Muslim majority nation states must support the UN agendas and reject the cries of the ultra-conservative religious. If the choice is between religion and human rights, then human rights must reign. Religion must be kept out of the debates. To assume that religion would stay out of the debates was both naive and dangerous. For one thing, such a response increased the fervor of the Islamists, who also insisted that Islam and human rights are incompatible. For them, there is an Islamic solution to everything. Whether the sources of this solution was explicit texts from the Quran or Sunnah, developed by early jurists or past and present intellectuals, or rendered by increasingly web-based media-savvy ad hoc authorities whose interpretation rarely take adequate consideration of our complex current circumstances and lived realities, such solutions were seen as immutable, divine, not subject to debate, and superior to any human-made systems, documents, or international instruments. As if we could really implement God's law without people's intervention and interpretation. At the International Women's Conference, the animosity between those who advocated for the international instruments as the sole method for advancing the cause of Muslim women were put face to face with those who advocated for an uninterrogated notion of Islam as their method. A third perspective was also present, but it was in its nascent stage with no clear methodology or implementable strategy, let alone coherent objectives. However, most importantly, it argued that the either-or dichotomy did not reflect the overwhelming majority of Muslim women. The idea that that must be either human rights or Islam was false. Surely there are challenges to be launched against the international assertions of universal human rights, but the goal is not to abandon them altogether, rather to read in the nuance, quote, "For human rights to be universal, it must be integral to the culture and experiences of all societies everywhere. Human rights require validation in terms of values in each culture and in terms of shared and similar values of all cultures." Most Muslim women then, you can see, unquestionably identify with Islam. At the same time, many Muslim women express concern over experiences of disjuncture between what is promoted as the ideal of Islam and their own lived realities. In the 20th century, these lived realities were increasingly being made public. With so much attention, however, the push to disavow Islam was no doubt confusing, if not also confounding. Further clarification was needed to distinguish this third perspective from the Islamists, because this third perspective also refused to disavow Islam. Personally, I chose to identify myself by a two-part name, pro-faith and pro-feminist, so pro-Islam and pro-feminism. On the other hand, this third perspective also critiqued certain practices and the underlying patriarchal structure in the development of Islamic canon and in Muslim cultures. As such, they were shunned by the Islamists as being one and the same as secular Muslim feminists. In fact, this is when the secular feminist identity became most coherent. Before this time, with very few exceptions, Muslim women argued as Muslims, maintaining a kind of allegiance to Islam, albeit uninterrogated. With the rise of Islamism, this uninterrogated Islam took on political force. Those who had been developing along the lines of a global perspective on gender and women's rights began to lean more towards the left. Some were ambiguous about religions, others were religiously non-conforming, while still others were willing to negate religion in all forms, including or especially the one they were born into. The fervor of removing Islam from the argument over gender rights moved towards what I am now identifying as the secular Muslim feminist movement. This perspective would become more pronounced from this time forward. That is, so the end of the 20th century, this movement became more clear. It's rare to hear a Muslim woman disavowing Islam in the first wave Muslim women's movements. However, the conflated understanding of universal human rights and the post-Enlightenment distinction between such rights and religion was combined with the need to combat Islamic extremism and Islamism. Secular Muslim feminists thus became a distinctive and explicit identity. As this identification became coherent, the methodology of argument by Islamic sources was abandoned and condemned as backwards. As such, the development of a new, more nuanced mediating articulation would go unnoticed for some time. In an effort to defeat the ill effects of Islamism with its exclusionary vision of the future for Muslims, international funders and research organizations rallied to the support of Muslim feminists, secular organizations and groups, and to their researchers. There was increased publications and a burgeoning of non-government organizations. Soliciting funds and publication opportunities for this in-between group would be quite tedious and very limited. For one thing, the in-between voice was building a coherent methodology and clear objectives. The most crucial part of this methodology was to critique definitions of the key terms: Islam, human rights, and feminism, and to interrogate their varied relevance to the lives of Muslim women. In fact, the term feminism became a linchpin. It's interesting to note that neither term, Islam or feminism, were subjected to more dynamic development initially. However, without this interrogation, it is difficult to distinguish the next development of gender discourse in action. The meeting of Islam and feminism was only possible when such an interrogation was followed through. Heretofore, feminism had to be Western, had to be secular. For those who would develop into or were already self-recognized as secular feminists, this projection of feminism was not a problem. Similarly, for the Islamists, this projection was unproblematic because it helped to fuel their refusal to adopt the term feminist, no matter what the nature of their advocacy or their activism. For a period of time, this reified usage of the term feminist helped clarify who was who. Equally problematic, however, the reified usage of the term Islam, which was acceptable to both groups. When both terms, that is Islam and feminism, were challenged, then the edges of the debate moved forward by leaps and bounds, and that would be the beginning of Islamic feminism. The post-colonial feminist analysis raised question of imperialist and essentialist assumptions of the liberal feminist project, where third world women and Muslim women are victims of their cultural values and practices, needing to be rescued and rehabilitated. Quote, liberal feminist positions have not adequately addressed how the colonial past continues to inform the post-colonial present, contemporary relationships of domination and subordination, and understandings of difference, where treatment of difference is connected to the history of European colonial invasion. The liberal feminist project of human rights assumes that women's needs and desires are both universal and uniform. Gender becomes a universalizing strategy that argues that all women are similarly oppressed. Gender becomes the axis of identity and location, devoid of an analysis of economics, labor, ideology, ethnicity, politics, sexuality, and other divisions and differences among women. It was easy enough, however, to interrogate the term feminism for its secular and Western biases. Within its own ranks, these critiques had been developed by third world feminists, by religious feminists, by African American feminists or womanists, by poor feminists, by Marxist feminists, by lesbian or bisexual feminists in the West. Thus, the term feminism was thoroughly vetted to shake loose its privileged location of the first wave Western women's movement. By the second wave, the mandate for the term to reflect the lived realities of more diverse women than the white middle class that it started with was well underway. Shaking the term Islam from its narrow conservative usage would take longer, and in many ways it's still unfolding. The crux of the feminist response to larger populations of women globally was already in the core of the term feminism as defined by Simone de Beauvoir, the radical idea that women are human beings. In this regard, since international documents for human rights are also attempts to articulate a fundamental idea of what it means to be human, it has also been challenged in the context of complex global pluralism. The existence of more and more specific documents like the rights of the child indicate the means by which it's used to reach its own goal of universalism. The problem of the notion of human being as viewed by the relativists is that it is in fact relative. Unless and until all human beings accept the notions, the goal has not been reached. One of the main contributions of Islamic feminism to the women's movement was the authentic challenge to the politicization of the neoconservative understanding of Islam. It began with a gender-inclusive analysis of the notion of human being in the Islamic intellectual traditions and primary sources. Fixing upon simple Islamic cosmology articulated in the Quran, the human being is an agent of the divine will, or Khalifa. Since this articulation is fundamental in the text and the foundation of the Islamic worldview, why has its application to a woman been curtailed by other functionary relationships? The standard measurement of patriarchy within Muslim historical and cultural contexts limits a woman's agency to God only as it manifests in her agency to men and to family. The agency of a man, however, remained independent or direct to God, even when family relationships could be seen as important. The best way to locate the discrepancy between women and men's human agency could be traced to the development of Muslim personal status law. The person is not adjudicated in Muslim personal status law. It is the status of the person within the patriarchal family that is adjudicated. Establishing and maintaining the patriarchal family does not require women's human rights or agency. It does not even require social justice in the way that we understand it today. Perhaps this is a result of the exclusion of women's perspectives from the codification process and the establishment of the primary canon. In the classical fiqh text, women are depicted as sexual beings, not as social beings, and their rights are discussed only in the context of family law. The classical fiqh notion of women's rights is nowhere more evident than in the definition of the marriage contract, which treats women as semi-slaves. One can say that the disparity between men's and women's rights in Muslim societies was and still is sustained largely through the rules that classical jurists devised for regulating the formation and termination of the marriage contract. In this respect, there's really no major difference between the various fiqh schools. All share the same inner logic and conception of family, according to Ziba Mir Husseini. The patriarchal family is built upon unequal or complementary relationships. Does this complementarity fulfill the divine purpose on earth or achieve agency, the ultimate obligation of all human beings created by Allah? A woman's service to men or family should never be a trade-off for her service and agency to Allah. However, in the patriarchal family structure, the only one known for a millennium within Muslim and other cultures, the challenge to the autonomy of women's agency are seen as good and natural byproducts of her nature. Furthermore, to reject the patriarchal family would have been seen as the same as rejecting to participate in the community or even in Islam. It was not a price the overwhelming majority of Muslim women were willing to pay, so they made their peace with it. Eventually, the Islamist agenda would advocate the wisdom of this structure. Even the secularists would acquiesce to it. No one questioned the Islamic origin of this asymmetry. How do we determine if this was a divine intent or the product of interpreters who were limited to and influenced by their own social and cultural realities? Since no articulation of egalitarian family was practiced at the time of the Prophet, developed in Islamic law, or envisioned by secular Muslim feminists and Islamists alike, this very notion of family became indisputable. This was where a radical reform was needed. It could only evolve with a rigorous overhaul of the underlying notion of human being and family in Islam. It is interesting to note how Muslim women moved forward in challenging almost all levels of women's roles in the public space while still referring to archaic constructs of family in the private space. Muslim women developed a bifurcated personality even within the context of the secular feminist movement. Home and family was without question. Public roles, education, politics, and economics had to be challenged for their exclusionary dimensions for women. Meanwhile, Islamist women who brought their agency forward into the public domain as well acquiesced to notions of family that left them subservient. More importantly, in the public realm, Islamist women advocated loudly for maintaining this deference in the private sphere. This advocacy was in fact crucial to their legitimacy as activists in the public domain. There is no doubt that women's roles in Islam are part of current global debates. More importantly, unlike at any other time in history, Muslim women themselves are leading these debates. I've tried to outline here the differences between three main perspectives in the debates. Certainly there are far more nuances taking control over what the future of Islam and gender will look like. At stake is the fundamental understanding of what Islam intends for women as human beings, agents of Allah, and as citizens in the global context. As Muslim women, notions of gender from pre-modern times are untenable. However, the ability to counter such ideas by formulating new ones has gained momentum only within an Islamic framework with the kind of work that has been done under the banner of Islamic feminism. Islamic feminism, then, works to establish a new egalitarian epistemology of Islam based on its own primary sources without the intermediary of patriarchal thinking. Islamic feminism says Islam belongs to all of us. All of us have a stake in how our religion is defined, but also how religious ideas are implemented in our policies and in our homes. Furthermore, notions about women's subservience as a result of certain medieval constructions, reflecting the understanding of jurists and philosophers at the time, are not divine constructions. We are free to understand divine constructions for ourselves and in our context. When we do this, we unveil a much broader vista of gender possibilities than heretofore practiced or imagined. In our context, as creatures created by Allah, notions of justice, that essential principle inherent in all Islamic texts, must be in accordance to our lived reality. For the medieval jurists, justice was a kind of guardianship. Women needed to be protected. The selected historical fiqh to meet the social needs of women then remained part of the traditional pre-modern framework. But justice today is not perceived of simply as an act of kindness towards women. Rather, justice is seen as a relationship of horizontal reciprocity to other human beings because of a profound understanding of the divine mandate of the oneness of God. In other words, Tawheed becomes the basic operating principle for the reform of Islam and Islamic thought because it develops a dimension of interhuman relations of equality and reciprocity. At the metaphysical level, God is the highest ultimate reality, but that has to be implemented in the actions of the law and in the development of policy, as well as in the home and family. For women and gender, then, the question is not whether or not we want to remain a part of family, but whether or not the family reflects the reality of this harmony and reciprocity. Thank you very much.
महकती खुशबू ने एक एहसास जगाया, किसान में पकाया, प्यार से खिलाया, रंग मेरी लगन का उन्हें खींच लाया, किसान में पकाया, किसान में पकाया, प्यार से खिलाया,
किसान ने पकाया, प्यार से खिलाया।
أشرقت نفسي بنور من فؤادي حينما رددت يا رب العباد وانتشت روحي وصار الدمع يجري يا إلهي خذ بقلبي للرشاد أشرقت نفسي بنور من فؤادي حينما رددت يا رب العباد وانتشت روحي وصار الدمع يجري إلهي خذ بقلبي للرشاد. أشرقت نفسي بنور من فؤادي حينما يا ربي أرجو منك عفوا. اعفو عن ذنبي وحقق لي مرادي. نفسي بنور من فؤادي حينما رددت يا رب العباد. وانتشت روحي وصار الدمع يجري. يا إلهي خذ بقلبي للرشاد. أشرقت نفسي بنور من فؤادي حينما رددت يا رب العباد. وانتشت روحي وصار الدمع يجري.
الحمد لله الذي بيده الملك وهو على كل شيء قدير. هو الأول والآخر والظاهر والباطن وهو بكل شيء عليم. الحمد لله الذي خلق فسوى والذي قدر فهدى والذي أخرج المرعى فجعله غثاء أحوى. الحمد لله الذي لا نحصي ثناء عليه وهو كما أثنى على نفسه. وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له. وأشهد أن سيدنا ومولانا محمدا عبده ورسوله أرسله بالحق بشيرا ونذيرا وداعيا إلى الله بإذنه وسراجا منيرا. صلى الله تعالى عليه وعلى آله وعلى أصحابه وبارك وسلم تسليما كثيرا كثيرا. أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما. وقال تعالى قل إن الخاسرين الذين خسروا أنفسهم وأهليهم يوم القيامة ألا ذلك هو الخسران المبين. لهم من فوقهم ظلل من النار ومن تحتهم ظلل ذلك يخوف الله به عباده يا عباد فاتقون. وقال النبي صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم إنكم لتموتون كما تنامون وتبعثون كما تستيقظون وتحاسبون بما تعملون ثم إنها لجنة أبدا أو لنار أبدا. وقال النبي صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم يا أبا سفيان والله لتموتن ثم لتبعثن ثم ليدخلن محسنكم الجنة ومسيئكم النار. وقال النبي صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم يا أبا سفيان جئتكم بكرامة الدنيا والآخرة أو كما قال صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم. میرے محترم بھائی اور دوستو، اس دنیا میں بھیجنے والا اللہ ہے، خود نہیں آئے، اور واپس لے جانے والا بھی اللہ ہے، کوئی جانے کا ارادہ کرے یا نہ کرے۔ بھیجنے والے نے بھیجا ہے اور وہی واپس بلائے گا۔ نہ پیدائش میں ہمارا اختیار ہے، نہ واپسی پہ ہمارا زور اور قابو ہے اور اختیار ہے۔ پیدا بھی کرتا ہے، واپس بھی بلاتا ہے۔ امات و احیا، زندگی اور موت کا سلسلہ چلا ہوا ہے۔ یہ کیوں چلا ہوا ہے؟ وَهُوَ الْعَزِيزُ الْغَفُورُ، وہ عزت والا، بخشش والا۔ کون ہے؟ الذی خلق الموت والحیات، جس نے زندگی اور موت کو بنایا۔ کیوں بنایا؟ لیبلوہم ایہم احسن عملا، وہ یہ دیکھنا چاہتا ہے کہ ان بندوں میں، ان مرد عورتوں میں اپنے عمل کو خوبصورت کون بناتا ہے، اور کون اللہ کو راضی کرتا ہے، اور کون ہے جو اس مٹ جانے والے گھر، اس مچھر کے پر، اس دھوکے کے گھر، اس مکڑی کے جالے پر ضمیر کے، ایمان کے، عزتوں کے سودے کر کے چند گھڑی کے، چند لمحوں کی لذتوں پہ اپنے آپ کو بیچ کر مالک کو ناراض کرتا ہے۔ اللہ یہ دیکھنا چاہتا ہے، فَيَنظُرَ كَيْفَ تَعْمَلُونَ، ہم دیکھیں گے تم کیا کرتے ہو۔ الف لام میم، الناس ان يتركوا ان يقولوا آمنا وهم لا يفتنون، یہ خیال دلوں سے نکال دو کہ کلمہ پڑھنے کے بعد تمہارا رب تمہیں آزمائے گا نہیں، آزمائے جاؤ گے۔ وَلَتُبْلَوُنَّ فِي أَمْوَالِكُمْ وَأَنفُسِكُمْ، آئے گی جان مال پر اللہ تعالیٰ حالات لائے گا اور پرکھے گا کہ کون سچا۔ فَلَيَعْلَمَنَّ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ صَدَقُوا وَلَيَعْلَمَنَّ الْكَاذِبِينَ، ہم پرکھیں گے کہ کھرا کون نکلا، سچا کون نکلا، اور ہم دیکھیں گے کہ غلط راہوں پہ کون چلا، ایمان کے سودے کس نے کیے، ضمیر کو کس نے تھپک کے سلایا، اور اس مٹ جانے والے گھر پر کون ریچھ کے اپنی آخرت کو قربان کر کے مرا۔ کہا ہم یہ دیکھیں گے، اس کو نہ کوئی دھوکہ دے سکتا ہے، نہ اس کی آنکھوں سے کوئی چھپ سکتا ہے۔ لا یعزب عن ربک من مثقال ذرہ، ایک ذرہ تو چھپ نہیں سکتا۔ لا یشغلہ سمع عن سمع، ساری دنیا کا بولنا اسے غافل نہیں کرتا کہ میں کیا بولا اور وہ کیا بولا، وہ سب کی سننے پر قادر، سب کو دیکھنے پر قادر، سب پر نظر رکھنے پر قادر۔ اب میں نے ادھر دیکھا تو وہ نظر نہیں آ رہے، اور انہیں دیکھا تو اب یہ نظر نہیں آ رہے، آگے دیکھتا ہوں تو پیچھے تو ویسے ہی نظر نہیں آتا، اوپر دیکھتا ہوں تو نیچے نظر نہیں آتا، آگے دیکھتا ہوں تو پیچھے نظر نہیں آتا، پیچھے دیکھتا ہوں تو آگے نظر نہیں آتا۔ لیکن میرا رب اپنی نظر کے بارے میں فرماتا ہے، لا يعزب عن ربك من مثقال ذرہ، ایک ذرے کے برابر کوئی چیز تمہارے رب کی نظروں سے چھپی ہوئی نہیں ہے۔ وہ یعلم ما یلج فی الارض وما یخرج منها وما ینزل من السماء وما یعرج فیها وهو معاکم اینما کنتم واللہ بما تعملون بصیر، زمین کے اندر ہو یا اوپر ہو، آسمان کے نیچے ہو یا اوپر ہو، وہ آہستہ ہو، زور سے ہو، رات کے اندھیرے میں ہو، دن کے اجالے میں ہو، ہر چیز پر، جاندار ہو، بے جان ہو، متحرک ہو، جامد ہو، ساکت ہو، تہ خاک ہو یا خاک کے اوپر ہو، آسمان کے نیچے ہو یا اوپر ہو، کالے پانیوں کے نیچے ہو یا اوپر ہو، مشرق میں ہو یا مغرب میں ہو، شمال میں ہو یا جنوب میں ہو، آسمانوں پر ہو یا زمین پر ہو، ماضی میں ہو یا حال میں ہو یا آنے والے زمانوں میں ہو، میرا اور آپ کا رب کہتا ہے کہ کوئی چیز تیرے رب کی نظروں سے چھپی ہوئی نہیں ہے۔ لا تحسبن اللہ غافلا عما يعمل الظالمون، مجھے غافل نہ سمجھو۔ سواء منکم من اسر القول ومن جہر به، زور سے بولو جیسے میں بول رہا ہوں، تیرا رب سنتا ہے، دل کی دھڑکنوں میں بولو تو تیرا رب سنتا ہے۔ ومن هو مستخف باللیل، رات کے اندھیرے میں چلو پھرو، سجدہ کرو یا شراب پیو کا تیرا رب دیکھتا ہے۔ رات کا اندھیرا ہو، دن کا اجالا ہو، مستخف باللیل وسارب بالنہار، یا دن کے اجالے میں ہو، رات کا اندھیرا، دن کا اجالا اس کے لیے برابر ہے، انسان جنات اس کے لیے برابر ہیں، مشرق مغرب والا اس کی نظر میں برابر ہے۔ اپنے دیکھنے کی ایک مثال دیتا ہے، یرا دبیب النملۃ السوداء علی الصخرۃ السماء فی اللیلۃ الظلماء، رات کا اندھیرا، پھر پہاڑ کا کالا پن اندھیرا، پھر چٹان کالی، کالا پن اندھیرا، پھر اس پر پتھر کالا، پھر یہ اندھیرا، پھر چونٹی کالی، پھر اس کا اندھیرا، پھر اس کی حقیر ٹانگیں، پھر ان کا اندھیرا۔ تو آپ کا رب سمجھانے کے لیے ہمیں بتاتا ہے کہ میرے بندو، تم تو 5-6 فٹ کے ہو، تم کہاں مجھ سے چھپ سکتے ہو؟ ارب ہا ارب چونٹیاں ہیں رات کے اندھیرے میں، رات کی سیاہی میں، کالے پہاڑ پر، کالی چٹان پر، کالے پتھر پر، کالی چونٹی جو جا رہی ہے، تو میرا یہ دعویٰ نہیں کہ میں چونٹی دیکھ رہا ہوں، تیرے رب کا دعویٰ یہ ہے کہ اس چونٹی کی حقیر ٹانگوں سے اس چٹان اور اس پتھر کے اوپر جو لکیر پڑ رہی ہے تیرا رب وہ بھی دیکھ رہا ہے۔ تو فاسٹ والوں کو نہیں دیکھے گا، رات کے ناچنے والے اور رات کے رونے والوں کو نہیں دیکھے گا، رات کے ڈاکو اور رات کے تہجد گزار کو نہیں دیکھے گا، گھنگور کی چھنک اور آنسوں کی چھلک کو نہیں دیکھے گا، آنکھوں کے سامنے ہے۔ لا تحسبن اللہ غافلا عما يعمل الظالمون، یہ نہ سمجھو کہ میں غافل ہوں، یہ نہ سمجھو کہ میں سو گیا ہوں۔ لا تأخذه سنہ، اونگتا بھی نہیں، ولا نوم، سوتا بھی نہیں۔ لا تحسبن اللہ غافلا ما كان ربک نسیا، بھولتا نہیں۔ لا یضل ربی، فیصلے غلط نہیں، ولا ینسا، بھول بھٹک کوئی نہیں۔ ما مسنا من لغوب، تھکن تھکاوٹ کوئی نہیں ہے، ساری کائنات اس کی مٹھی میں ہے۔ الارض جمیعا قبضته یوم القیامہ والسماوات مطویات بیمینہ سبحانہ وتعالی عما یشرکون، ساری کائنات بحر و بر پر اس کی اکیلے کی حکومت ہے، نہ اس کا کوئی شریک ہے، نہ کوئی وزیر ہے، نہ کوئی مشیر ہے، نہ کوئی نگہبان ہے، نہ کوئی پہرے دار ہے، نہ وہ اس کے لیے کوئی جگہ کی ضرورت ہے، نہ مکان کی ضرورت ہے، نہ کھانے کی ضرورت ہے، نہ پینے کی ضرورت ہے۔ لا یحویہ مکان ولا یشتمل علیہ زمان، لا زمان بھی ہے، لا مکان بھی ہے، سونے سے پاک ہے، کھانے سے پاک ہے، بیوی بچوں سے پاک ہے۔ متخذ صاحبۃ ولا ولدا، نہ اس کی کوئی بیوی ہے، نہ اس کو کوئی بچہ ہے، نہ اس کو کوئی مشیر ہے، نہ اس کا کوئی وزیر ہے، وہ وزیر سے پاک ہے، مشیر سے پاک ہے۔ تھکن سونے اونگ ہم سب پر اس کی نظر ہے، ہمیں میدان دے دیا ہے، یہ سیدھا راستہ ہے، یہ غلط راستہ ہے، یہ اللہ تک پہنچاتا ہے، یہ شیطان تک پہنچاتا ہے۔ ان راہوں کے پرے جنت ہے، ان راہوں کے پرے جہنم ہے، ان راہوں کے آخر میں رب کی رضا ہے، ان راہوں کے آخر میں رب کی ناراضگی ہے۔ تمہیں اختیار ہے، فمن شاء فلیؤمن ومن شاء فلیکفر، یہ میری راہیں ہیں، ان پہ چلو، اور یہ سیدھا ہے، یہ غلط ہے، اب تمہاری مرضی ہے، ادھر چلو یا ادھر چلو۔ دیکھنے والا اللہ نہ سویا ہے نہ غافل ہے، یہ تو ایک انتظام ہے کہ ادھر فرشتے بٹھا دیے، ان علیکم لحافظین کراما کاتبین یعلمون ما تفعلون۔ اللہ کو فرشتوں کی ضرورت نہیں ہے، ایک نظام بنایا چلا ہے، ادھر ایک بٹھایا وہ اچھائی لکھتا ہے، ادھر ایک بٹھایا وہ برائی لکھتا ہے۔ جب اللہ تعالیٰ کی بارگاہ میں حاضر ہوں گا تو میرا رب میری فائل سے کھولے گا، کہے گا اقرا کتابک کفی بنفسک اليوم علیک حسیبا، میرے بندے یہ پڑھ، یہ تیرا پیپر ہے، یہ تیری کاپی ہے، یہ تیری فاسٹ کی زندگی ہے، یہ تیری گھر کی زندگی ہے، یہ تیری آفس کی زندگی ہے، یہ تیرا لوگوں کے ساتھ سلوک ہے، یہ رات کی ہے، یہ دن کی ہے، اجالے کی ہے، اندھیرے کی ہے، جوانی کی ہے، بڑھاپے کی ہے۔ دیکھ ان میں سے کوئی غلط تو نہیں لکھا ہوا، کوئی زیادتی تو نہیں ہوئی، پاکستان پولیس کی طرح غلط ایف آئی آر تو نہیں کٹ گئی، پاکستان کے عوام کی طرح کہ جرم ایک کرتا ہے 10 کو 20 میں ڈالتے، پولیس کو برا کہتے ہیں۔ پہلے برائی تو عوام سے شروع ہو رہی ہے کہ جرم ایک کرتا ہے، اینو وچ پا لو، اینو وچ رکھ لو، اینو وچ رکھ لو، ایدو تے بھی پا دیو۔ یہ جس معاشرے میں ظلم پھیل چکا ہو اس معاشرے کا زندہ رہنا بھی ایک معجزہ ہے۔ حضرت علی کا فرمان ہے، نظام کفر کے ساتھ چلتا ہے، ظلم کے ساتھ نہیں چلتا۔ جب معاشرے میں ظلم پھیل جاتا ہے تو اللہ تعالیٰ اس معاشرے سے نظریں ہٹا لیتا ہے اور وہ معاشرہ حقیر ذلیل فقیر ہو جاتا ہے۔ ہمارے زوال کا سبب یہ نہیں کہ بجلی کوئی نہیں اور گیس کوئی نہیں، ہمارے زوال کا بہت بڑا سبب ہے کہ ہمارے عوام بھی ظالم ہیں، ہمارا غریب بھی ظالم ہے، مالدار بھی ظالم ہے، دیہاتی بھی ظالم ہے، شہری بھی ظالم ہے۔ حکومت تو بعد میں آتی، پولیس فوج تو بعد میں آتی ہے، پہلے تو عوام میں ظلم کی جڑیں گہری ہو چکی ہیں اور اس حد تک جا چکی ہیں کہ ظلم کرتے ہوئے احساس ہی نہیں کہ میں کتنا بڑا گناہ کر رہا ہوں، شراب پیتے ہوئے احساس ہے کہ گناہ کر رہا ہوں، زنا کرتے ہوئے احساس ہے گناہ کر رہا ہوں، کسی کو دھوکہ دیتے ہوئے کوئی احساس نہیں کہ میں کتنا بڑا ظلم کر رہا ہوں، کتنا بڑا گناہ کر رہا ہوں۔ 3 چیزیں ایسی ہیں جو معاشرے کو زیرو کر دیتی ہیں، تباہ کر دیتی ہیں، صفحہ ہستی سے مٹا دیتی ہیں، اور وہ تینوں میرے دیس میں موجود ہیں۔ میں حکمرانوں کو رونا کیا روں اور میں محکموں کا رونا کیا روں، میرا تو ریڑھی والا بھی اس کا شکار ہے۔ ایک ظلم جس معاشرے میں ہوتا ہے وہ معاشرہ زندہ رہنے کا حق کھو دیتا ہے۔ ایک جھوٹ جس معاشرے میں جھوٹ ہوتا ہے وہ عزت کا حق کھو دیتا ہے، ذلت کا طوق ان کے مقدر کر دیا جاتا ہے۔ میرے نبی نے فرمایا تمہیں بڑے گناہ بتاؤں؟ کہ یہ کیا؟ کہ شرک کرنا، قتل کرنا، ماں باپ کی نافرمانی، اور آپ ایسے ٹیک لگا کے بیٹھتے، ایسے ٹیک لگا پھینک، اور اب بتاؤں، سیدھے ہو گئے، پہلے ٹیک لگا لی پھر یوں سیدھے ہو گئے، اور اب بتاؤں، اور اب بتاؤں، الا وقول الزور، الا وقول الزور، الا وقول الزور، اور جھوٹ اور جھوٹ اور جھوٹ اور جھوٹ، اس کو اتنا دہرایا، اتنا دہرایا، اتنا دہرایا کہ صحابہ فرمانے لگے ہمارے جی میں ہے کہ کاش اب آپ چپ کر جاتے، کاش اب آپ چپ کر جاتے۔ اور دوسری جگہ فرمایا جھوٹی گواہی، جھوٹی گواہی، جاؤ پاکستان کی عدالتوں میں دیکھو ٹکے ٹکے گواہ بک رہے ہیں کہ ساڑھے کول گواہی لے لو، ساڑھے کول جی پواونے جی پوا دو۔ تو ایک ظالم معاشرہ سر اٹھا کے زندہ نہیں رہ سکتا، پست ہونا ہی مقدر ہے۔ ایک جھوٹ، ایک جھوٹ ایسی لعنت ہے، میرے نبی کا فرمان ہے الصدق ینجی والکذب یہلک، جھوٹ ہلاک کرتا ہے، سچ نجات دیتا ہے۔ ہمارے چھوٹے چھوٹے بچے جھوٹ بولتے، ماں جھوٹ بولتی، باپ جھوٹ بولتا ہے، بھائی جھوٹ بولتے ہیں۔ سیاستدانوں کا جھوٹ تو بہت بعد میں آتا ہے، ریڈی والا جھوٹ بولتا، سیل مین جھوٹ بولتا۔ 1 کروڑ پاکستانی اکٹھے کروں تو ایک بھی سچا نہیں ملے گا مجھے۔ تیسری چیز دھوکہ، خیانت، بددیانتی، ایک ہی گناہ کے کئی نام ہیں، دھوکہ، فراڈ، بددیانتی، خیانت۔ جس معاشرے میں خیانت، دھوکہ، فراڈ، بددیانتی داخل ہو جائے، اس قوم کے لیے زوال ایسا ہی یقینی ہو جاتا ہے جیسے شام کو سورج کا ڈوبنا یقینی ہوتا ہے۔ جیسے سورج کو واپس نہیں لا سکتا، اس معاشرے کو ذلت سے واپس کوئی نہیں لا سکتا۔ جتنے مرضی عالی شان حکمران بٹھا دیے جائیں، اگر یہ 3 کام موجود ہیں، لوگ ظالم ہوں، لوگ جھوٹے ہوں، لوگ بددیانت، دھوکے باز، فراڈی ہوں، تو دنیا کی کوئی طاقت انہیں عزت کے سیڑھیوں پر نہیں چڑھا سکتی۔ ان کے لیے ذلت کی گہرائیاں مقدر ہو گئیں۔ ضربت علیہم الذلۃ والمسکنہ، ذلت اور مسکنت لباس بنا دیا جاتا ہے۔ اللہ کے نبی سے پوچھا گیا یا رسول اللہ، مسلمان آپ کا امتی کنجوس ہو سکتا ہے؟ کہاں ہو سکتا؟ آپ کا امتی مسلمان بزدل ہو سکتا ہے؟ کہاں ہو سکتا ہے؟ یا رسول اللہ، مسلمان آپ کا امتی جھوٹ بول سکتا ہے؟ کہا نہیں، جھوٹ نہیں بول سکتا، جھوٹ نہیں بول سکتا۔ آپ نے فرمایا میرا امتی ہر عیب کر سکتا ہے، 2 کام نہیں کرے گا، اگر میرا ہے تو 2 نہیں کرے گا، ایک جھوٹ نہیں بولے گا، ایک دھوکہ نہیں دے گا۔ اگر وہ جھوٹ اور دھوکے والا ہے تو میری امت سے خارج ہو گیا ہے۔ نماز چھوڑنے سے نہیں کہا میری امت سے خارج ہو گیا، روزہ چھوڑنے پر نہیں کہا میری امت سے خارج ہو گیا، زکوٰۃ چھوڑنے پر نہیں فرمایا میری امت سے خارج ہو گیا، شراب پینے پر نہیں فرمایا میری امت سے خارج ہو گیا، زنا کرنے پر نہیں فرمایا میری امت سے خارج ہو گیا، حج چھوڑنے پر نہیں فرمایا میری امت سے خارج ہو گیا، جھوٹ اور دھوکے پر فرمایا میری امت سے خارج ہو گیا۔ من غش فلیس منا، جس نے کسی کو دھوکہ دیا میری امت میں سے نہیں ہے۔ جھوٹ بولنے والا، دھوکہ دینے والا وہ میری امت سے نکل گیا ہے۔ تو پیچھے واقعی کیا رہے گا؟ 16 کروڑ میں 16 آدمی ڈھونڈنا مشکل ہو رہا ہے۔ جس معاشرے میں ظلم چلتا ہے، جس معاشرے میں جھوٹ چلتا ہے، جس معاشرے میں خیانت چلتی ہے، دھوکہ، فراڈ، فریب چلتا ہے، اس معاشرے کے لیے ذلیل ہونا طے کر دیا جاتا ہے۔ تم ایٹمی طاقت بن کے دیکھ نہیں لیا کتنی عزت پائی، ایٹم بم بنا کے کتنی عزت پائی، مزید ذلتیں بڑھ گئیں، مزید پستیاں بڑھ گئیں۔ کسی کی سازش نہیں ہے، یہ امریکہ کی سازش ہے، یہ برطانیہ کی سازش ہے، یہ فرانس کی سازش ہے۔ ہاں، یہی عادت ہے زوال شدہ قوموں کی کہ وہ اپنے عیب اوروں پہ تھوپتے ہیں، اپنی کمزوریاں اوروں پہ تھوپتے ہیں۔ پیٹ میں درد ہو تو یہ بھی امریکہ کی سازش۔ اپنے اندر عیب ڈھونڈو، اپنی کمیاں ڈھونڈو، اپنے من میں ڈوب کر پا جا سراغ زندگی۔ تجھے کیوں فکر ہے اے گل دلے صد چاک بلبل کی، تو اپنے پیرہن کے چاک تو پہلے رفو کر لے۔ قوموں کا زوال اندر سے آتا ہے، باہر سے نہیں آتا. تو ادھر ادھر کی نہ بات کر، یہ بتا کہ قافلہ کیوں لٹا، مجھے زنوں سے گلا نہیں، تیری راہبری کا سوال ہے. قوموں پہ زوال اور نہیں لاتے. امریکہ والے اتنے فارغ نہیں ہیں، یورپ والے اتنے فارغ نہیں ہیں، آسٹریلیا افریقہ والے اتنے فارغ نہیں ہیں کہ تمہارے زوال کو سوچیں. زوال اندر سے آتا ہے، باہر سے نہیں آتا. بیماری اندر سے اٹھتی ہے، باہر سے نہیں آتی. اور اسباب اندر پیدا ہوتے ہیں، باہر نہیں پیدا ہوتے. جیسے جسم کی بیماری کے اسباب اندر پیدا ہوتے ہیں، قوموں کے زوال کے اسباب بھی اندر ہی پیدا ہوتے ہیں. قوموں کا سفینہ اسی وقت ڈوبتا ہے جب خود ان کے ہاتھوں میں برمے ہوں اور وہ اپنے کشتی میں چھید کر رہے ہوں، اس وقت سفینے ڈوبتے ہیں. جو وہ اپنے بادبانوں کو تیر مار رہے ہوں، اس وقت سفینے ڈوبتے ہیں. جب اپنی تختی اپنی کشتی کے جب وہ تختے اکھیڑتے ہیں، اس وقت سفینے ڈوبتے ہیں. جب قوموں میں ظلم آ جاتا ہے، خیانت آ جاتی ہے، جھوٹ آ جاتا ہے. ریڑھی والے کو کون جھوٹ بلوا رہا ہے؟ کس کی سازش سے یہ جھوٹ بول رہا ہے؟ کس کی سازش سے نوجوان ماں باپ کی نافرمانی کر رہا ہے؟ کس نے سازش کی ہے کہ ماں کی ذرا سی ڈانٹ پر بیٹا اچھل کے وہ جاتا ہے؟ کس نے یہ سازش کی ہے باپ کی تھوڑی سی آنکھیں دکھانے پر بیٹا گریبان پکڑنے کو آ جاتا ہے؟ میں نے اپنے کانوں سے سنا، ایک بچی ماں کو کہہ رہی تھی بھوک نہیں، بھوک نہیں، اور اس کی ماں کے بڑے بڑے آنسو ایسے گر رہے تھے. یہ کس کی سازش ہے؟ سچائی نکل گئی، جھوٹ نے ڈیرے ڈال لیے، انصاف نکل گیا، ظلم کی گھٹائیں چھا گئیں، دیانت رخصت ہو گئی، بددیانتی تجارت بن گئی، فراڈ تجارت بن گئی، دھوکہ تجارت کے نام پر دھوکہ. یہ کس کی سازش سے ہوا ہے؟ میرے اپنے کردار کی خوشی سے ہوا ہے، میرے اپنے پاؤں پہ کلہاڑی مارنے سے ہوا ہے. پھر اور بہت سے اسباب ساتھ جمع ہو جاتے ہیں، لیکن کسی قوم کی ہلاکت کے 3 بڑے سبب ہیں. ایک ظلم، جھوٹ، خیانت. ان پر جنید بغدادی بٹھا دو صدر پاکستان، اور شیخ عبد القادر جیلانی بٹھا دو وزیر اعظم، نہیں نکال سکتے زوال سے. زوال سے اسی وقت نکلیں گے جب توبہ کریں گے، جب ان غلاستوں سے نکلیں گے، جب ان اعمال سے نکلیں گے. جب ہلاکو خان نے بغداد کو فتح کیا تھا اور 15 لاکھ انسان تہ کر دیے تھے، تو مستعصم باللہ رات کا تہجد گزار تھا، دن کا روزے دار تھا، مسلسل روزے رکھنے والا، مسلسل رات کو جاگنے والا. حکمران کی نیکی کام نہیں آتی جب عوام میں نافرمانی ناسور کی طرح پھیل جائے اور کینسر کی طرح